All right, so how does a writer start a rewrite process if the writer is alone and doesn't have a producer or a director to work with? Now, of course, I say, because I'm me and I have an ego, I'd say read my book. That's the way to start. But let's say you don't have my book and you want to sit down and look at your script. You know it needs a rewrite. You're not exactly sure what to do. So then you do the basic things. What am I trying to say? So that is your premise. That is to say, love conquers all, even death. You figure out what your screenplay is about in broad terms. Not the story, but what the screenplay is trying to say. And then you would write that down. And then if you haven't written biographies of the characters, the central characters, the protagonist, the antagonist, the central emotional relationship, then sit down and write those biographies. And especially, it's especially helpful if you write those biographies in the voice of those characters. So if you have a character from the South in the United States, you would write in the voice of a Southerner, maybe who doesn't have an education, so you would write in a certain way. And then maybe you write the voice of the antagonist, who's a New York professional doctor or lawyer, and you would write in that person's voice. And that would help you later on in your dialogue, but it also helps you understand who that character is. So you write the premise, the biographies, and then you would go through your screenplay and figure out, what is my structure here? Do I hit the main points that we need to have for structure? Now, in my book and in other books, there's different ways to approach that. But most people would agree that a screenplay is 3 acts, even though the middle act is really 2 acts, but we call it 3 acts. And we would read the screenplay to say, does it have a beginning? Does it have a middle? Does it have an end? I think that there are 7 points in the screenplay, and it's up to everybody to figure out what they want to do with that. But make sure that the structure of the screenplay is good. Then I would read through the screenplay and read each scene and say, does this scene move the story forward? Does this scene tell us something about the central character? Does this scene have conflict? And if any one of those elements is missing, you either have to fix that or you have to throw that scene out. And then the next thing is, I would read it through for the dialogue and see, is the voice of this character consistent through this? Have I changed it as I've been writing it? Do I need to go back at the beginning and make it sound like the person at the end? Even though that person has changed, they haven't changed the way they speak in general. They're still speaking in the same way, in the same accent, same language. So I would do that. And then I would go through the screenplay and say, have I said everything? Have I made it visual? It doesn't always have to be in all this order, but these are things that you have to do. Is it visual? Am I telling the story with images? Because that is the way that it affects most people, and that is the way that translates from one country to another country, no matter what the dialogue is. If you could tell it visually, then everybody can understand what this movie's about. If you turn down a movie and turn the sound off and watch it, you should be able to follow the story pretty well. I've done that on airplanes all the time, looking over somebody's shoulder and watching the movie, and I understand exactly what's going on. If it's a good movie, that's what happens. So there's a couple of stages that you would do. Another stage would be to make sure that there is conflict in every scene, make sure every scene is in the right place, make sure that there is rising action. All these things have to be done. But there's also the final touch, which I call the Mercedes pass, because we know that in the United States there's a certain amount of money that you're paid to write a script. It's about the same amount of money as a minimum as you would pay for a big Mercedes-Benz. So if you go into a showroom where they're selling Mercedes-Benz and you see one with scratch marks and torn tires and the radio's upside down and the steering wheel is broken and the seats have slashes in them, the cuts, and it's $100,000, you say, if there's one next to that that's perfect, the paint job is great, the tires are good, which one are you going to buy? You're going to buy the good one. So you have to make sure your screenplay looks good as well. Looks as good as the story it's trying to tell. So that's the final touch that you do. So there's a process. If you follow the process, you will get to the next draft. Then is that the final draft? Probably not. Now you have to start the process all over again and read it all over again for those same things to make sure that it's the best that you can possibly do. Well, sometimes the second draft is worse than the first draft. There's no doubt about it, because you're still experimenting, and you should experiment, and you should make changes, and you have to read each draft over again. And there's ways to read a draft to look for the structure, to look for the dialogue, to look for the description, to look for just the format, to look for spelling errors even. And sometimes you should be free in your rewriting to experiment. And sometimes an experiment works, and sometimes it doesn't work. You know, the first rockets that eventually were used to go to the moon, they failed. They fell over, or they blew up, or whatever happened to them. So what? It's the process. How many different ways of making the filament in a light bulb did Thomas Edison go through? I think it was over 100. But failure is progress. You have to look at it that way. And you have to try different ways to reach your end. But that means you also have to know what end you're moving towards. So that's why when I talk to my students and I talk to other writers, I say, what are you trying to prove with this screenplay? What are you trying to say with this screenplay? Are you moving towards that, or you're not moving towards that? Or if somebody gave you notes that made you go off this direction instead of the direction that you want to go to. You can still listen to those notes and make changes, but go back and follow through with what's really important for that screenplay. Now, one of the problems that you see in some screenplays and some movies, where you go, what the hell is that about? And why does this movie fail? And it has 5 or 6 writers. That's because one writer wrote it, they brought in another writer to rewrite it, they brought in another writer to rewrite that. This third writer did not know the intention of the first writer. So how would he be able to find out? Maybe the first writer didn't explain the intention well enough in the script, so it's not clear. I'm not saying that the third writer can't be good, but I'm saying that sometimes they don't understand what the screenplay is about, and they start fooling around with it, and it turns into shit. And that happens. As I tell my students, shit happens every day. You have to deal with the shit. So as a screenwriter, you have to read your screenplay over again, and you have to listen to people that give you notes, and you have to understand that it's never going to be perfect, that you're going to continue to change it, and that when it gets on the stage, it's going to change again, and that when it gets into the edit room, it's going to change again, positive or negative. It could go both ways. But if the writer is always there to be a consultant on set in the editing room, then it's going to fulfill its purpose much better. And that's why I think a writer should be on those sets. That's why the Writers Guild has now made it part of their rules, their working rules, that the writer can be on the set if he wants to be, if she wants to be, and can be in the edit room, and can see a rough cut and decide to talk to the director and say, I think it would work better if this happens. But it's still up to the director to make that change. After a while, the writer has to let it go. But up until the point where it's not locked yet, the writer should be able to have some input. Doesn't mean that the director is going to listen to the writer, but the writer has to understand that it's constantly edited until it's finally finished. It's never perfect. If sometimes the producer or a director or even the actor doesn't understand why the character is doing something or not doing something, then you have to ask yourself, what is this character's goal? First of all, we need to know who that character is. You need to know who that character is, the physiology, the sociology, the psychology of that character, and you have to know the character perfectly well from inside out. But then you have to think, well, in this particular story, what is the character's goal? What does the characters want? What does the character want? And how does that change in the middle to what does the character need? But in every scene, that's the same thing. What does the character want? What does the character really need? If you don't know, your actor's not going to know. And you have to write that in there. And it has to be either in the dialogue or in the description. Usually it's going to be in the dialogue. The character's going to say, I want that book. Give me the book. that's clear. If the character just says, I want something, that's not clear. So you have to be clear. You have to be specific. The more specific you are and the more clear you are, the better. On the other hand, I'm going to contradict myself now, and that in dialogue, sometimes it's better not to be clear, to write in subtext. So one example I use for my class is in the central character in Sideways, Miles, is talking about Pinot Noir, the grape, and wine made from Pinot Noir. But he's not talking about that, he's talking about himself. So sometimes you have to hide it behind something. But your actor should know from reading that, if he's a good actor, or she's a good actor, who they're really talking about. And the director should know. And if you haven't made it clear, then you have to make it clear. It's all about clarity so that everybody can present what's inside here. You've put it on paper so that they can present it there so that it's on the screen. So here, there, and there, that's how it works. So clarity of expression is very important. You can't be too vague. You have to be clear. Now the danger there is to be too clear and to describe everything. If I was describing a college classroom, I don't have to say there are computers on the table, there's a chalkboard, there's a television screen. I can just say a college classroom and let the people that do the job. Let the production designer do the job. But if I have a specific college classroom I want to describe, then I describe that, because it has to show the intentions of my characters, and it's important in the screen, in the viewing audience, that they see those things. So what's important you have to describe, what's not important you don't have to describe. And that goes for the dialogue too. If it's not important to say, then you don't write it, because everything that you put on the page is important, and if it's not important, take it off the page. And the same thing applies for a director. A director should be looking at a scene, and everything in that scene has to be important, everything that we see in that scene. So if we see a roll of tape on that scene, that tells us something about the character or the story. If we take away the tape, that also tells us something about it. So every little piece that's in the scene, if there's a vase with flowers in it, that means something. If there's no vase, that means another thing. And if we want to say something, we have to put it there. Directors have to be in charge of that. Of course, there's a production designer that's done that. And of course, there's a wardrobe person that has clothed the person. And there's a makeup person. But the director has to say, at a certain stage, we want to have that in the screen. And we want to see that on the screen. The writer, if it's important to the writer, has to say, there's green makeup on that particular person. Wizard of Oz, for example. And that's an important thing. If the writer doesn't say she has green skin, then it's not important. So the writer has to be very clear as to what his or her intention is, and write it on the page so that people can see it in their heads, so they can make it happen on the screen. The writer has to take charge a little bit. The writer has to say, do you want me to do this? And the writer has to question, what exactly are you looking for? You're looking for a stronger character? Are you looking for more conflict here? What is it that you want to do? So you have to ask the producer. I had a producer once, and I think I've mentioned this to you before, but I had a producer once who said, that scene just lies there. Okay, tell me, what do you mean by that? Because I don't understand how I would change it from that. And this producer did not know how to express himself, because he was a new producer and he had never dealt with a writer before. So it would be up to me to ask him, well, what do you see as the problem here? And maybe he couldn't tell me what the problem was. And I would have to figure out what the problem is with that scene. As it turned out, the problem with the scene is there was no conflict. So it's up to the writer to figure something, to interpret what the producer is saying. Sometimes the producer will say, there's no conflict in this scene. What you need to do is this and that and the other thing. And then you do that. And then if the scene works better, great. If the scene doesn't work better, then you have to make some more changes. And you have to decide for yourself, does this scene work better the way he's asked me to make it work better? Or does this scene not work better the way he has asked me? And if that's the case, you have to make it better the way you see it, and then let them deal with it. And then they'll either tell you, yeah, it's much better. Like I said earlier, he's more likable. Sometimes it's just that. You know, sometimes you have to save the cat. This is the title of a book, but you have to show the person being likable. They save a cat, they walk a dog, they kiss the baby, whatever they do to make them more likable at the beginning of a story. So it's up to the writer to find out what really the producer is looking for. Even though the producer doesn't know what they're looking for, you have to make it better. So how do you make it better? You'll go back again. Biographies, premise, story, construction, all that. You have to do all that. The average number of rewrites that screenwriters do before it goes to the stage is about 25 to 30. That's a lot of rewriting. So it's part of the process, and you have to accept that. New writers don't always understand that the first draft is perfect. It's not. They think it's perfect, but it's not. The second draft, still not perfect. The 20th draft, still not perfect. It's never perfect, as a matter of fact. But it's better. So each draft that you write is better. And you have to accept that people are going to tell you things that may hurt because they don't know how to tell you the right way so that you can approach it the right way, but may hurt, but they may be right, but they also may be wrong. So you have to keep in mind what you are trying to say with your work, because we all want to say something important with our work. We want a paycheck, yes, but we're writers and we want to influence people's thinking, and we want to make people feel things. We want to make people happy. We want to make people look inside themselves. We want to make people cry. We want to make them feel something. So we have to feel those things. We have to know those things. We have to know the world. But we also have to be tough and hold on to our story and our ideas when we're writing. So we have to know that it's okay what we think, but it's also okay to listen to other people and what they think and take what works for our story and use that and improve that. Now, if they're paying you to do that, we have to listen in a slightly different way, and we have to understand that they need what they need. But sometimes if what they need is not good for the story, we have to be strong and say, I don't think that would work. Can you make that work for me? And then go on, and they'll usually say, you know what, maybe that's not good for the story. Maybe you should do it your way. Or they'll say, you know, I just don't know how to change that, but give it another try. And so you give it another try. Now there's an apocryphal story, I'll just tell you very shortly, about somebody who turned in a script, and I think it was at Disney. And the executive said, you know, he's not a likable character. Can you make him more likable? And so the writer went back to his or her office, and I don't know if it was a man or a woman, and just wrote in the first description of the character, Joe, a likable guy. And then turned in the new script, and the executive said, yeah, it's much more likable. So there's all kinds of ways to please a producer, but you have to be ready to stand up for what you think is right and to hold your own way of approaching a story. It depends on who you're writing it for. If you're writing it for yourself, sometimes I'll say it's still the second draft. Sometimes if I think I've written a lot, I'll make it the third draft. If I'm writing for pay, there's a very definite amount that we do. And the Writers Guild determines that, and you sometimes determine that yourself. The schedule works like this. You write a treatment, you get notes on the treatment, you write the first draft, you get notes on the first draft, you write the second draft, you get notes on the second draft, then you write a polish. If they want you to write more, and what is a polish? That's very much up to you and the producer. If they want you to write a lot, it's not a polish. If they want you to adjust the dialogue, one or two characters, or add a character or take out a character, that's still a polish. But if it's changing a lot of scenes, that's another draft. If you're writing it for yourself and you're trying to improve from one draft to the next, it's not important what you call it. I would call it, because I always like to save all previous drafts, because maybe I experimented in draft number 3 and I screwed up a scene. I want to go back to draft number 2 or even draft number 1 to rescue that scene and put it back in. Maybe I've taken out a scene, maybe I want to put it back in. Maybe I put in a scene and I want to take it out in the next draft. I may or may not call it a draft, that's up to me. If I'm not getting paid, I could decide what's another draft. And so it's very fluid, it's very flexible. If you're writing for money, there's another issue, because a lot of times they'll say, can you do a draft for the studio? For the studio. Means they want you to make another draft with notes. You've got notes from them. They want you to write another draft that they don't want to pay for. And you have to say, you mean you want me to write another draft? Or you want me to write a polish? Fine, then you're going to pay for it. You don't say that, your agent says that. So you say to the producer, are you talking about another draft? And the producer will say, yeah. Or I'm just talking about a polish. And you say, okay, good, I'll have my agent call you. And then let them argue. That's why you paid your agent. So that you don't have to get into an argument as to how much you should be paid. If you're writing on your own, that's a whole different thing. But if you're writing for pay, you should get the pay for the work. If you do the work, you get the money. That's the way it works.